Today, we have the honor of having Paola Moffa-Sanchez present at this month's AMOC webinar series. Paola is an assistant professor at Durham University. Her research interests lie in the understanding of decadal to millennial scale ocean variability and its relationship to climate over the recent past, including the last millennia, the current interglacial, and the last deglaciation. In regards to the role of the ocean climate, her regions of interest include the North Atlantic and Arctic, the tropical Pacific, and the intermediate waters formed around the Southern Ocean. These interests tie nicely into the paper that she will be presenting over today as part of the special edition, Variability in the Northern North Atlantic and Arctic Oceans Across the Last 2 Millennia, a review. So thank you so much for presenting today, Paola. Please take it away when you are ready.
Thanks for the invitation and thanks for organising these seminars. They've been great so far. I would also like to thank AGU because they really facilitated the publication of this paper and they made some concessions. As you can see, we've got 13 authors with really different backgrounds, but there was a large group of us that were early career scientists. This was a great team effort and I'm really happy to be presenting some of this today. So why is this not working? Right. Okay, so the outline for today is as follows. So I'll be giving a brief introduction and a history and the motivation behind this review paper. I will outline some of the methods that we use, but more generally what we normally use in proxy reconstructions. And then I'll move on to the results from the proxy side and the modeling side. And then I'll just have some conclusions at the end. So first of all, we know that the climate has changed at centennial timescales in the past. And we know this from several records that indicate that there was climate variability in the past. There were periods that seemed to be warmer and periods that seemed to be colder than average. We know this from all these archives, but there's also documentary evidence that indicates that those centennial climate changes had some impacts on societies. So for instance, during the Roman warm period, there was a Roman expansion. Vines, which are really temperature sensitive, were being able to be planted further up north and surviving. And then during medieval times, there was an increase in the settlements in Greenland. The climate was much milder and these settlements were allowed to happen. And then we've got periods like the Little Ice Age, where temperatures were colder than normal in Europe, particularly in the winter. And we see things like the price of grain in Dutch guilders, and you can see here different countries in Europe and how these increased in price as we got to 1500s. And there's also pictorial evidence for this. And a large part of this historical climatology was really carefully studied by the British meteorologist Hubert Lamb. And aside from all of the great work he did by putting a lot of information together, looking at meteorology, but also looking at different evidence from different archives, he was really the first one to make that relationship and start thinking about whether the changes in the ocean and the atmosphere had indeed been responsible for these changes these climate changes that were recorded around the North Atlantic, particularly in Northwest Europe. So 20 years after, there was an increase in sediment cores in the North Atlantic, and there was and these studies here all hinted at the fact that perhaps a northward heat transport in the North Atlantic could also change in our current interglacial, and some of these centennial events that we saw in different archives and documentary evidence were just a result of changes in the overturning circulation in the North Atlantic. And this really comes because of parallelisms through the abrupt climate variability present in the last glacial. And I think, and a lot of it was based on that. So it's thinking that perhaps the similar changes were happening in our current interglacial, the Holocene. But the problem with these studies is that the resolution was not perhaps as high as needed to look at multi-decadal variability and centennial variability. But this was 20 years ago, and 20 years after, we've got an incredible range of things that we can use to try and study the oceans in the past. And so here I've just put a few examples. So we can have sedimentary archives, which are mostly sediment cores that we call, and then we can recover different organisms, and either the diversity within the species diversity or the chemistry of some of the organisms or some of the organic molecules can tell us something about the environment in which those compounds were locked. Those compounds lived in, and then they were locked into the sediment archive. And things like changes in ice rafted debris can also indicate changes in ice. There's also measurements of changes in sea ice by using certain compounds. So 20 years later, the amount of proxies and the amount of archives has actually increased quite a lot. There's a new addition, which are these banded archives, which is organisms that they just put a layer of, they calcify and they put a layer of calcite, or they just put a layer in their shell, and their chemistry can also tell us something. And the beauty of these is that they can be dated absolutely because they put a layer every year. And so there's an increase in these archives as being really good to understand multi-decadal variability, because some of these sedimentary archives, for instance, don't have that temporal resolution, and sometimes they don't have, they have a lot of age uncertainties. So we've got an increase in proxy and in archives. And if you're interested in how we do this in the past, then we compiled a table, which is by no means comprehensive, but it can give you an idea on how we do this in the past and what we use in order to reconstruct either temperatures or deep bottom, near bottom flow speeds. And then, of course, over the last 20 years, there's been a great improvement on climate models. There's a lot of climate models that now run for the last 1,000 years, so that we can also analyze these. And the beauty of this is that we can probably get a better handle on the processes and the physical processes in the ocean that might explain some of these proxy reconstructions. So just to highlight how much it has changed. So, for instance, in this review, we had this criteria to select some of the records, and some of the records that we selected would have. So they would have at least more than 500 years, so they would be longer than 500 years, and they would have a resolution of less than 100 years, and they would have limited, so at least 4 age constraints within that record. And so this is what we have, and so the available records around 2000, it was this many. Only the black ones had enough high resolution or enough. So only the ones in black actually met the criteria that we've used in this review. Sorry, but my mouse seems to be delayed. So, and here we've got how many we've included in this review. So these are all of the points where we reconstructed ocean changes in this review. And here we've got, so the length is 150 years, the average resolution 100 years, and 4 dating points. Okay, and this is a bit of a messier one where you can probably see whether one of your records was included or not. So it's the name of the record or the publication where that data set was included. Okay, so since the overturning process in the Atlantic is very hard to reconstruct using proxies on these timescales, what we tried to do in the review is that we split some of these proxies bearing in mind where they sat. So, for instance, we have figure 2 and figure 3 and figure 4. These are the regions that are based by the extension of the Gulf Stream water. So all these Atlantic inflow waters flowing into the Nordic seas, all curving around the subpolar gyre. And then another 2 regions that we had, which included figure 5 and figure 6, are these fresh polar waters that flow south into the subpolar North Atlantic, and then around as part of the East Greenland current system, and then around as the Labrador current. So we divided the surface like that, and then we just put all of the deep waters separately, which is not that many, and I'll show you later. So we start with the warm Atlantic waters. So we divided into 3 regions and we compiled the data sets from these regions. And I'm not going to show all of the figures because there are quite a lot of wiggles, but I'm just going to try and summarize a little bit of our findings, and then I will show some of the data that we thought that did show some coherent changes. So here we've got region 1. What we saw was that there was large regional variability, and we thought that perhaps this was because some of the high resolution archives were coming from enclosed bays. So we've got the Gulf of Maine, and then we also have Chesapeake Bay. We also, and then around the Scotian Shelf, the signals here can be a little bit difficult to interpret because you've got different waters that are bathing the site. So you've got this extension of the Labrador Current. You also have these shelf waters, and then you also have some of these warm Gulf Stream waters. So we thought that perhaps the fact that they didn't seem to be coherent could be explained because of this. Region 2 was the North Atlantic Current and the subpolar North Atlantic, and there's a few reconstructions around here, and some of them even had different proxy carriers. So, for instance, different types of organisms were used to reconstruct. And what we could see is that even some of them from the same core revealed really different results. And what we know from these organisms and the biases from these proxy records is that perhaps seasonality biases on when these organisms are living and where they're living in the water column can actually bias a little bit this signal, and it makes them not look very coherent. And then, as you can see here, we've got a cluster of records over here, the right-hand side, and they're all on the Scottish Shelf, and they all showed they were all consistent showing a recent warming. And we did wonder whether that was just coastal warming that was recorded by these archives. I'd like to show this region in a little bit more detail. This is the Norwegian current that splits into 2 quite early on, and then it keeps on flowing northwards. And there's several records in their way. And what we could see is that these are all of the records put into a time series plot. And what we could see here is that, so this is the ones that are close to Fram Strait, and there's not a lot of variability. There's a bit of discrepancies between the recent between these two. Thinking perhaps again some biases in the proxies. But what we can see in the Norwegian Sea is that there's a lot of things like drift ice, things like temperature seem to have this general cooling trend towards the modern. So we see this cooling trend towards the modern in a lot of these records, especially in the high resolution records. What we see is, where I put these arrows, is that there's a step change, which coincides with the onset of the Little Ice Age, or around that time. You can see that in several of the records. And this was interesting because, yeah, we're already we are in the Norwegian seas, and the patterns here seem to be more coherent across them. So if we move on to the polar waters, so these southward flowing polar waters through the East Greenland Current, you can see there's a few records here, and then we've got also this other record, all these other records in West Greenland, and also in the path, well, close to the Labrador Current. So the West Greenland Shelf is a little bit tricky because a lot of the records were from fjords, and there was really complex local ice-ocean interactions happening within those fjords, and some of these bays and fjords have actually been studied in quite a lot of detail, and it was very difficult to pick up some coherent patterns within them. These reconstructions over here, also very different patterns. Wonder whether there were records that were very close to the coast, and this also affected some of the signals recorded here. So let me show you some of the data that we found from the East Greenland Current. So here we've got, yeah, please bear with me. So we've got drift and sea ice here on the left-hand side. So all of the proxies that would give us an indication of changes in drift ice and sea ice getting through the East Greenland Current all the way to the subpolar, to the Eastern Labrador Sea. So what we see here is that, yeah, again, you have an increase. So so this is going from high up so high latitudes in the East Greenland all the way south. So I put it in a latitudinal distribution, and what we can see is that increased sea ice is, I just made it so the y-axis is cooling. So we saw increase in sea ice in a lot of these proxies. The same with drift ice. You can see the general trends. These are all the proxy, the temperature reconstructions, and again you see there's long-term cooling over the last 2,000 years, and this seems to be consistent again with what we saw in the Norwegian seas earlier. Again, there's some of these step changes that are present in some of the proxy reconstructions, where you have either step changes over here or a bit delayed here, and some of them culminating in the coldest and most ice present during the Little Ice Age, which would agree with some of the historical records. But this was really interesting to find out, because it could probably be pointing towards where some of these, what was forcing these centennial changes either in the ocean and in the climate. So just quickly, I would like to show you the deep reconstructions that we have. And so this, we've compiled all of these reconstructions, mostly the suitable silt, which is a proxy that measures the grain size of the sediment. And this is sorted through, so the grain size is sorted through the depositing current. So the larger the grain size, the faster the depositing current is flowing. And so here are some of the reconstructions. And here we've got, so it's going from north. So this is the Iceland-Scotland overflow waters going from north to south. So this is really close to the ridge in black. And then you have this one in red. So they're color coded to the cause. What you can see is that there's actually quite a lot of variability closer to the ridge. It seems that there's a cooling and half, so in the last millennium, but then you have other reconstructions that seem to show that, sorry, not a cooling, is getting slower. And then here you've got some reconstructions that are actually getting faster. So quite difficult, and probably because of the bathymetry, it's quite complex, and also there's probably a lot of interaction between the overflows and the mixing and entrainment with intermediate waters as it comes through over the ridge into the basin. And here we've got some other records from the Denmark Strait overflow waters, and some of the records produced close to the upper deep western boundary current, either temperatures or also flow speed. So you can see that there's a really wide variety of changes. And also there's not a lot, so perhaps we should start thinking about doing depth transect so we can monitor the flow speeds a little bit more comprehensively across some of these areas. Okay, so let's move on to the models quickly. I'm not a modeler, but Eduardo Moreno is actually on this call right now, and he would be able to answer all of the questions. He led the modeling component. So we produced some last millennium model analysis looking at the AMOC strength, Denmark Strait overflow, and the polar gyre strength. And this is a description of the forcing estimates that were used to drive each of these experiments included in this study. And this was the last 1,000 years, because there's runs that go 1,000 years, and the next there would have been runs that span the last 21,000 years, and there would be lower resolution. So these are some of the time series from these models, and you can see that these are 3 models with different number of members within the model. And what you can see is that there's actually quite a lot of variability, and there's very little coherence across the models. You can see perhaps a reduction in the AMOC here closer to the modern, but it's really not clear. So there was these differences could be due to different forcing protocols, so different models use different forcings, and it could probably point towards the fact that we should probably standardize the forcings that are being applied to the models. We can look at the regression of the AMOC strength, so all the parameters that I just outlined, onto sea surface temperatures. And looking at this, what we can see is that actually the only one, so that's the dotted areas are the ones that are statistically significant. And so this is the correlation coefficient And what you can see is actually the AMOC strength and SSDs have a positive relationship, and it's shown across the models, either in the pre-industrial or in the industrial, in some of the areas that have been already pointed towards being able to use these regions as AMOC fingerprints. It's a bit different now with the Denmark Strait overflow and the polar gyre strength, because there's not a lot of coherence across the models, which makes it a little bit difficult to interpret. So I just want to move on to comparing some of the models and also looking at some of the proxy reconstructions, but more on a spatial spatial scale. So this is a comparison. So what we did is that we used only the proxies that had sea surface temperature, and sea surface temperature could be down to 200 meters or 300 meters. So we just used anything that gave us an idea of surface water temperatures. And then we just calculated whether it was higher or lower across these time periods. So we used the medieval climatic anomaly and the Little Ice Age. And what we find is something that I already pointed at earlier, is that a lot of the temperature was colder during the Little Ice Age in some of these regions. So I already pointed at this before when looking at the time series. We also compared recent versus pre-industrial, and this shows a little bit more of a complex picture, actually. So these areas have been mostly used to get at changes in the overturning circulation following fingerprints from models. So we would expect these two. Areas to be having different temperature changes, and we would also expect this area over here to be consistent. So the center of the subpolar gyre. But what we see in all of the records is that actually there's quite a lot of varied. The proxy reconstructions are showing a very varied response. So just to finish off, so we have seen an increase in the number of subcentennial North Atlantic Ocean reconstructions, and I've showed that quite visually in this talk. The qualitative regional comparison reveals some regional divergences in the trends of the ocean records, but others, such as East and South Greenland, reveal a consistent changes in millennial timescales. And then I think in order to be able to compare proxies and models better, we need to start thinking about how we refine our proxy knowledge, and also how we start comparing that proxy knowledge with the models. Okay, so further work should include a statistical approach to compile these records and study their coherences. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paola. So if you have a question for her, use the raise your hand button next to your name, or you can type your question into the chat box if you have any audio problems. It looks like Jonathan Bamber has a question. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask it out loud?
Yeah, sure. I couldn't find the raise hand. The app wasn't working for some reason, so I'm using the web-based thing. Yeah, really nice talk. I enjoyed that. It's not totally my area of expertise, but and I may have misunderstood what you were showing one of the earlier plots where you're looking at proxies for sea ice extent, which looked like you had an increasing sea ice area, perhaps, or I don't know, I presume it's proxy for area, throughout the period of your reconstructions. Is that right?
So really what the sea ice reconstructions really depend on this molecule that is produced by these organisms that live in the sea ice. So the only thing we can say is whether there was sea ice presence at the site or not. So we don't really get a handle on whether there's on whether the sea ice was expanded then or not. So it's just at that place. The good thing is that if we start seeing this around Greenland, we can probably start thinking, okay, well, very likely sea ice edge was expanded around Greenland.
Okay, yeah. Are you familiar with the paper by Kinnard? It's a little bit old now, but they do a reconstruction of Arctic sea ice extent from marine sea salts on terrestrial cores, all pan-Arctic, and their conclusion is that sea ice now, or at least say a decade ago, is lower than at any time during the last 1,500 years. And I wondered whether that was consistent or inconsistent with your reconstructions that you were seeing. It didn't look like it was.
No, but I think that is a really great question, and yeah, and I think the reason why we don't see that decrease, some of the records do show it, but the reason that some of these records are not showing this decrease in sea ice, it's because
years or
that's it. You're missing the top, and then you don't have that in a resolution. That would be gold dust if we would be able to find that top. And so actually, if you carefully look at some of them, you do see a decrease, like a spike decrease in the last few points. But then also in the marine sediments, you also have bioturbation that are mixing the upper centimeters. So it's tricky, but I think as we go further back and further, and now if we were to call, we might get a few other points. So yeah, no, that's a great question.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
We have a question from Chris Pykuch. Go ahead.
Hi, Paola. Thanks for that really great talk. Also like to thank you and your colleagues for going through the great effort to write this really helpful paper for the community. I guess looks like my video is not working, so I'll just stop it. So I have a question. I'm glad you pointed out in one of your conclusions, movement towards, collecting this great set of proxy records and folding it into some statistical or probabilistic model. Presumably, given the resolution of some of these proxies, you could also fold in some instrumental data too. So my question relates to this project of potentially folding in all these proxies to sort of a coherent probabilistic or statistical framework. Is there good enough knowledge about the temporal resolution of the various proxies? What I mean is, if you have sort of a measurement, a sortable silt measurement, I'm looking at, I've got, for instance, David Thornally's 2018 paper up here. In that paper, it looks like you've got sort of a sortable silt measurement every sort of 50 or 100 years or so. Do values like that represent a true time average, or are they more sort of just a snapshot measurement in time? I'm just wondering, to what extent these represent time averaged or sort of snapshot measurements, because that's important, right, for how we fold all these together and whether you're aliasing signals.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So it's not a snapshot. It would give you an average of that time. So basically, you've got if you sample. So when you take the core and you just sample at 1 centimeter, whatever you're recovering in that centimeter is averaging that time span that centimeter would equal. So yeah, you would have. It basically integrates that 1 centimeter. Okay, however long that is.
Okay, and if it's, again, forgive me, I'm not an expert here, but so the general question I want to ask, so that question was specific to the sortable silt measurement. Does that kind of reasoning apply more generally? Are sort of most of these proxies that you've accumulated in the sort of you've identified in this paper, are they also similarly in a time averaged sense?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So actually, I should probably say, so at the beginning, I presented 2 types of archives. We've got the sedimentary archives where you just have the sediment and it's just piling up in the bottom of the ocean, and it's incorporated the organisms that lived at the surface too, and then sunk to the bottom. But then we also have these bivalve mollusks, and we have coralline algae, and these are putting some layers. Therefore, these layers are really just that year. You need to be careful. They might be telling you about summer, but it's really, so they're different between what you're looking, but if you're looking at a sedimentary archive, you would be integrating across the time, and you make some assumptions on the uncertainty in that time. The more dates, so the more you date your core, the lower the uncertainty will be in terms of the dating. Don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. It's really informative. Thank you.
Okay, great. No, I do agree that, I mean, this was only step 1. We just pulled all of the records together. And I think moving on, there's a lot of scope to be playing with all of these records and seeing what we can extract from this.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you.
We'll take a few more minutes for questions. One from Hong Chen. Do you want to ask your question?
Hi, Paula. Hi. Great talk and great review. Thank you for that. I have a follow-up question on the sediment material again, especially closer to the recent time where you mentioned that there might be loss of core top or in bioturbation that might integrate or lose that signal. I was wondering, based on your compilation from the review, have you identified maybe sites that have much higher sedimentation rate than the rest, where you can focus onto that probably helps to improve the temporal resolution of the last decades or so?
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, completely. There's some of these sediment cores are really high resolution. They get up to 6-year resolution. I mean, it's incredible. Of course, in some of the other archives, you can even go further and look at annual resolution, which adds quite a lot of value. But yeah, no, you're right. There's certain locations that have higher accumulation.
Cool, thanks. And I guess that would, that's all. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
You did.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, a question from Christopher Pitwolf. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. Very interesting talk. I had a question about the AMOC fingerprints from the models. That I was struck by how different the pre-industrial fingerprint was from the industrial fingerprint. Is there a reason why the sort of the SFT response to AMOC changes would be so different between an obvious reason between the pre-industrial? The industrial is just like a sampling thing.
You mean in the models?
Yeah.
Yeah. Eduardo, are you there? Because he'll have a better answer than me. Maybe he can. I mean, I can attempt to answer.
Okay.
So the reason is because in some of the models see this weakening in the industrial versus the pre-industrial. So basically, the difference between the industrial and the pre-industrial in the fingerprint, the idea is that is because of the changes in the AMOC. You have this different correlation with the temperature. But I think if Eduard's around, he probably can give a more detailed explanation.
Hey, hello.
There you go.
Sorry. Yeah, so you need to take like the periods we use for the correlation are different. One is almost 1,000 years. The other one is 150. So perhaps the variability is different. We can. I mean, it was a very crude analysis. It's not like very detailed. So and there might be some delays between the AMOC and the fingerprint. So it was just an analysis of what can be done with models and to inform about whether one can find proxies or suitable proxies for AMOC fingerprints or subpological fingerprints or overflows.
Okay. Well, thank you. It's very interesting.
Thank you.
All right. Any final questions? I don't see anything that is coming up, so I think we will end it here. So thank you, Paola, for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for participating. The next AMOC webinar will be on December 17th and will be a talk by Joel Hershey on the paper, The Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation in High Resolution Models. So we hope to see you there next month. Thank you.